Okay, so you guys are always sending us really interesting stuff. And someone sent in this piece from Chris Linus's Substack from April 9th, 2025. And it talks about Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan Chase. And he had some pretty serious things to say about a potential recession.
Yeah, he did.
And what's interesting is he says it might be triggered by something you might not expect. Trade policy.
That's right. Dimon's, someone in his position, obviously anything he says is going to get a lot of attention and a lot of people talking.
Right.
And his comments have for sure done that,
Yeah.
So what we want to do in this deep dive is really get into what he's saying.
Exactly.
We want to understand what's making him so worried.
Yeah, what are the things that he sees that are, leading him to make these statements?
Yeah, and what could happen?
Yeah.
If things keep going the way they're going,
Yeah.
what are the knock-on effects for the global economy? And we're going to try and do this, in a way that everyone can understand.
Yeah, cut through the jargon, all the financial stuff that sometimes you hear.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just get right into it. What is he saying?
Right to the point.
Yeah, what is the big warning here?
Well, the main thing he's warning about is that all these really aggressive trade policies we're seeing from these big global powers, they're making it way more likely that we're going to have a recession.
Okay.
He actually said this at a big financial forum, so it wasn't like...
Right. It wasn't just like a random comment.
It's just a casual...
This was a preparer statement.
This is interesting because usually when you hear about, a potential recession, people talk about interest rates or inflation, as like...
Right, the usual suspect.
The things that are always sort of...
The things that are always kind of looming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he's saying that it's the way countries are interacting with each other on trade. That's the real problem here. Yeah. And those things that you mentioned, like inflation and monetary policy, those are always going to be a part of how the economy works.
Right.
But what Dimon's really saying is we got to pay attention to global trade.
Yeah.
Because right now, that's looking like it could be the thing that really kicks off a huge economic downturn.
Yeah.
It's like the whole landscape is changing.
So can you give some specific examples of what he means by these aggressive trade policies? Like, what is he actually talking about?
Well, he talks about a few different things. The big one, of course, is the trade tension between the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
That's been going on for a while, and it just keeps getting worse.
Yeah.
And there's all these trade disagreements going on with all these different European countries and blocs.
Right, right.
And then another thing he's worried about is all these restrictions that are popping up on technology and how data can flow across borders.
Yeah.
So it's like...
It's not just one big trade war. It's like all these little...
It's like death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. Yeah.
All these little friction points all over the world.
Yeah, and they all kind of feed each other.
Exactly.
Right.
And what Dimon sees happening is that governments, particularly the ones that are, the big players.
Right, the big economies.
Right. They're basically focusing on what he calls, these short-term, politically driven trade strategies.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking about the long game. How do we actually create economic stability and growth in the long term?
And that's done through open trade, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he had a really great quote about this.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
He basically said,
How was it?
When you close borders to trade, increase tariffs, and engage in retaliatory economic measures, it eventually comes home to roost.
Yeah.
And, that's him being pretty blunt.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Trade talk.
Yeah, these kinds of policies, they're going to come back to bite you.
Yeah. That's basically what he's saying.
Comes home to roost. Yeah, that's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah, and it really makes you think about all the economic theory out there.
Yeah.
Traditionally, protectionist measures have always been seen as a really risky strategy.
Right.
They can backfire pretty easily.
So how does he think this actually works?
Okay.
Like, how do these policies that he's talking about actually create problems?
Well, the main thing is it messes up all these global supply chains that have taken, decades to build up.
Right.
You got to think about these supply chains, like these huge global networks where all the different parts of a product get made in like a bunch of different countries before they're all put together at the end.
Right.
So when you start throwing tariffs and trade barriers into the mix, it's like throwing a wrench in the gears.
Right.
It just disrupts the whole flow.
Yeah.
Makes production more expensive and less efficient.
Yeah. Give us an example. So, like, let's say there's a company that makes I don't know, smartphones.
Right.
And they import a bunch of the components from different countries.
Right.
If suddenly there's a tariff on those imported components, their costs are going to go up.
Right.
That's going to affect their bottom line.
Of course. Yeah.
And then on top of that, it just creates all this uncertainty, which makes companies less likely to invest.
Right.
I mean, if you don't know what the rules of international trade are going to be next week, how can you plan for the future?
You can't. Yeah.
How can you commit to big long-term projects if you don't know what your costs are going to be, or if you're even going to be able to get the stuff you need?
Right.
It
makes total sense.
Yeah.
If you're a business and you can't rely on your supply lines and you don't know if you'll be able to sell your product, then you're going to be really hesitant.
Exactly.
To, make any big moves.
You're going to be really cautious.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the fallout. What happens if things keep going in this direction?
Well, Dimon's pretty clear that this is not just going to hurt one or two countries.
Yeah.
This kind of trade fragmentation could really hurt both developed and developing economies.
Okay.
He actually said, if these trends continue unchecked, we're looking at a real risk of recession, not just in the U.S., but globally.
Wow.
It's like a systemic risk.
Yeah.
It could have effects everywhere.
A global recession sparked by trade disputes?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty scary thought coming from someone like him.
Yeah.
I mean, he really knows what's going on.
Yeah, he's got his finger on the pulse.
Yeah. Does he think it's already happening?
Well, he pointed to a couple things that he's seeing that are kind of like early warning signs.
Okay, like what?
Well, one thing is that GDP growth is slowing down in a bunch of key economies around the world.
Oh, okay.
And the other thing is that the total volume of global trade is going down.
Okay.
And those are the kinds of things that economists look at to see if maybe things are headed for a downturn, So
he's seeing those numbers and he's thinking,
Yeah, exactly.
this isn't good.
Yeah.
So, okay, he's talking about these, big global things,
right.
GDP trade,
Yeah.
But what about the average business?
Right.
What are they dealing with on the ground?
Well, one of the big problems is that the rules are constantly changing.
Right.
Every country's got their own set of trade rules and restrictions, and it's just getting more and more complicated.
Right.
So businesses are having a really hard time keeping up.
Right. And then on top of that, their costs are going up.
Exactly.
Because of these tariffs.
Yeah. I mean, a tariff is basically a tax on imported goods.
Right.
So if you're a business that uses imported raw materials or components, your costs are going to go up.
Of course.
And what happens then?
They have to raise prices.
Yeah, they have to raise prices, which means consumers have less money to spend, which weakens demand.
Right.
And it can also lead to inflation.
So it's this vicious cycle.
Yeah. It's a really tough situation.
Yeah. Okay, so given all these potential problems, does he have any solutions?
Well, he definitely has some ideas about what policymakers should be doing.
Oh, what are they?
He's basically saying that they need to rethink their whole approach to trade.
Okay.
He said strategic competition doesn't have to mean economic isolation.
Right.
And that's a really important point.
Yeah.
He's not saying that countries shouldn't compete.
Yeah.
He's just saying that there's got to be a way to do it without, building up all these walls.
Yeah.
He thinks we need to find a way to balance national interests with the benefits of a global economy.
So he's saying we can have competition, but we need open markets too.
Exactly.
So that things can grow and be stable.
Right.
And he also says that businesses have a role to play too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, what should they be doing?
Well, one thing is diversifying their supply chains.
Okay.
So instead of just relying on one country or one region for everything, they should spread things out a little bit. Have multiple suppliers in different places.
Okay.
That way, if something goes wrong in one place, they're not completely screwed.
Yeah.
He's also encouraging businesses to invest in strategies that would make them more resilient.
Okay.
To trade disruptions and to get involved in trying to find diplomatic solutions.
So it's not just adapting to the current environment, but also trying to change it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like a two-pronged approach.
Okay, so it sounds like, despite all these warnings, he's not completely doom and gloom.
No, he's not.
I remember in the Substack piece, it talked about how he was cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, he's definitely worried.
Yeah.
But he also thinks that the global economy has a way of figuring things out.
Right.
He actually said, we've been here before. The world has a way of finding equilibrium, especially when economic consequences become too steep to ignore.
It's like he's saying that eventually common sense has to kick in.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
People are going to realize that these policies are hurting everyone. and they're going to start looking for a better way.
So the main takeaway here is that we need to be really careful about trade policy.
Exactly.
Because if we're not,
yeah,
things could get really bad.
The main thing to remember is that the decisions that are being made right now by these big economies,
Right.
they're going to have a huge impact on the global economy.
He's basically saying that what happens in Washington, Beijing, Brussels,
Yeah,
those are the places that are going to determine whether or not we have a recession.
exactly.
So for you listening, what Jamie Dimon is saying is that the way things are going with global trade,
Right.
it's making him really nervous.
Yeah.
And he thinks there's a real chance that it could lead to a global recession.
That's a great way to sum it up.
So here's something to think about as you go about your day. What do you think are going to be the most important things to watch in global trade in the next few months? What are the things that will tell us if things are getting better or worse? And how can businesses and individuals prepare for the potential changes that he's talking about?
That's a great question.
That's something to think about.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
You got it.